Bitcoin would be 100% worthless if no one could trust it. For anyone involved with Bitcoin, I'd recommend you watch until the end of this video because I've got some important perspective that you don't want to miss. It's a very important point to make that Bitcoin would be worthless if no one could trust it. Because in traditional finance, we've got banks to ensure that people are not double spending money and only spending money that they actually have. Banks also have their own internal cybersecurity departments that work to prevent people's accounts from being hacked and their life savings being drained. In the event that things like that do end up happening, since banks are all connected around the world, it's not that hard to reverse fraudulent transactions. Even if occasionally sophisticated entities are successful in siphoning money from banks, in the United States we have something called the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to ensure that people's bank accounts are guaranteed by the federal government up to $250,000 per person per bank. Many other nations also have similar depositor guarantee systems for their own respective fiat currencies. Bitcoin has none of that. Its transactions are final and irreversible, and it has to rely on network participants, or nodes, the economic incentives and psychology behind mining, alongside modern encryption techniques, to create a makeshift system that prevents double spending, spending money a person doesn't have, and rewriting existing transactions, all the while not being able to rely on a single centralized authority. Now the thing is, this system works surprisingly very well, which attests to the genius of Satoshi Nakamoto, the mysterious inventor of Bitcoin. If Bitcoin's security was not as ironclad as it is, it would be completely worthless. Because how can you store value in something that you're not sure will accurately reflect that you're the one that truly owns that value tomorrow? Bitcoin's security as it relates to a person's trust in the network to accurately reflect value can be broken up into two aspects. The Bitcoin blockchain security itself, which maintains the integrity of the entire network, and the security behind Bitcoin wallets, which maintains the integrity of an individual person's ownership of Bitcoin. In this video, I'm going to be going over the first aspect, and I'll be coming out with a video shortly on the second aspect. So be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss when that video comes out. I made an entirely separate video about what the hell a blockchain is, so I'd recommend you go and watch that first for some good context if you're not familiar with what a blockchain is at all. The Bitcoin blockchain's security and integrity is held tightly together by several things. The first is hashing. This is what gives every piece of identifiable data in a blockchain, including blocks, transactions, block headers, etc., their unique fingerprint, so that each piece of data can always be identified and verified. Hashing involves taking an input value, running it through a function called a hash function, and throwing out an output value. SHA-256 is a very commonly used hash function that takes in some data as input and outputs a hash value in the form of a binary combination of zeros and ones that results in 256 characters of zeros and ones in essentially random positions. This is represented in hexadecimal notation as 64 numbers ranging from 0 to 9 and letters ranging from A to F. Each character in this value, or string, can be one of 16 characters, ranging from 0 to 9 in numbers and A to F in letters. It's a one-way hash function, so the output hash value cannot be reverse engineered to determine the input, except by randomly trying every possible combination imaginable to guess which input, or key, matches up with which hash value. The number of possible key value pairs in SHA-256 is so large that it would likely take longer than the age of the universe to brute force guess which key matches up with which value, even with the world's most powerful supercomputers. This is what underpins the security of the Bitcoin blockchain. The fact that every piece of data has a verifiable fingerprint that can't be counterfeited. The second is that transactions are final once added to the blockchain. This finality of transactions is paramount to ensuring absolute truth in the Bitcoin network, since there is no centralized authority available to reverse transactions. This presents itself as a double-edged sword, in that if a person is not careful in what transaction they're sending on the network, it could be disastrous. But on the other hand, once that transaction is made, no government could hope to reverse it on the blockchain, which means that people are truly free to send money around the world on the Bitcoin network. The recipient of the first transaction would have to create a brand new transaction to send the Bitcoin back. So this means that governments have to physically confiscate a person's private key in order to send that Bitcoin back to the original sender. More on private keys in the follow-up video. The third is that the blockchain itself contains a history book. This book is what's known as the UTXO database, which I go into more in depth in my previous video on UTXOs. This UTXO database contains the entire history of transactions that have ever taken place in the Bitcoin network since the very first block on the blockchain back in January 2009. When someone decides to help secure the network, they run a Bitcoin node. If it's a full node, it synchronizes the entire blockchain's history, and in doing so, it creates its own copy of the UTXO database by going through all of the inputs and outputs of each block. This UTXO database is what ensures that nodes are aware of what Bitcoin has already been spent and by whom, so that people can't engage in double spending or spending what they don't have. This database is the fundamental key for maintaining the blockchain's integrity as a financial network. The fourth is that the blockchain is tamper-proof, and this has a lot to do with the hash values that I mentioned earlier. Each Bitcoin block's block header contains the hash value of the previous block. This is to ensure that if someone were to try and tamper with the previous block in the blockchain, to change the history of transactions, this action would make the next block point to an invalid hash value that is entirely incorrect and inconsistent from individual nodes' current copies of the original blockchain. In Bitcoin, the key rule that every node accepts is one where each node will only accept the longest valid chain as the source of truth. And Bitcoin miners will only build on top of the longest valid chain. The reason the longest chain is the source of truth for nodes in the network is because it's the one that miners have put the most work in, expending their own resources in the form of electricity costs to build and add blocks onto the blockchain. It's a metric that indicates collective monetary investment and a proof of work. Which brings me to the final piece of the blockchain security puzzle, is that new blocks are added to the blockchain by financially motivated and invested people to honestly prove that they've done the work and spent money on electricity to honestly create and add blocks to the blockchain. These people or entities are known as the Bitcoin miners, which are simply nodes that choose to mine Bitcoin. They do this because miners that successfully mine Bitcoin get rewarded roughly every 10 minutes in Bitcoin through a block subsidy, which is currently approximately 3.125 Bitcoin, along with any transaction fees. Since the blockchain is tamper-proof, and since nodes and miners will only work with the longest valid chain, the only way to become the longest valid chain and corrupt the Bitcoin network is to mine the longest valid chain. However, because miners compete with each other to win the block reward, they each control a share of what's called hash rate in the network. This hash rate is basically the work that's put in to successfully mine a Bitcoin block. And the one who puts in more work has a higher chance of mining a new block. Since this is the case, it's not possible for a malicious Bitcoin miner to create the longest valid chain for very long unless they control a majority of the hash rate in the Bitcoin network. A potential threat known as a 51% attack. I'll go more in depth on Bitcoin mining and 51% attacks in upcoming videos. But for now, just understand that all of these interlocking safeguards are what give the Bitcoin blockchain itself an ironclad degree of security and integrity that is impossible at worst and extremely hard and costly to overcome at best for anybody that wants to corrupt it and change the state of transactions and truthful ownership within the network. So that's about it for how the Bitcoin blockchain security works in a nutshell. Like I said, I'll be putting out the second part to this topic on Bitcoin wallet security soon. So like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss when that and other videos come out. Thanks for watching. Peace.